Well, hello everyone, it's Nina Marie. Thanks for joining me today for another video. I am so excited to be sharing today's projects with you because I am going to be using some brand new pattern papers from Tim Holtz Idea-ology. These are gorgeous. There are so many new collections within this release, and the papers have a wonderful theme to each one of them. And I can't wait to not only share the projects with you, but then I also will show you the pattern papers up close so you can kind of get a feel for the style and theme for each collection. So I have two projects that I'll end up making from two of the collections, but then I also will share at the end a couple of other projects that I made off camera just as some more inspiration using this new collection. All right, so let's talk first about French Industrial. This one has a lot of great postage elements, a very good neutral palette, lots of grays, browns, creams, and whites. You also do have that fun Parisian theme here and there too, which is fantastic. Wallflower is one of my favorites. I love the bright, sunny colors of this pattern paper collection. It's got some blues and yellows and greens. It's very springy with lots of florals and butterflies and birds. Has a lot of great ephemera elements to it as well, so you could cut apart a lot of these papers really nicely. Next up, we have Correspondence, the postage theme of this with the airmail and the airplanes. We've got some wonderful red, white, and blue color tones, great for also 4th of July colors as well. But this is a really good color collection, and I really loved the postage theme throughout. Next up is Dapper. This is such a fun collection because it's very masculine and it has a lot of beautiful, rich color tones to it. So deep, warm colors. We've got some blues, some great cigar labels, which is really fun. I love the contrast with the black and white. All right, and then next up, we've got Memorandum. I think this one's probably my most favorite out of all the collections. The colors and florals, the fun French Parisian feel on some of these papers, it just is magical. I love this paper pack, and I utilized this to create a fun little mixed media panel. Last up, we have Abandoned, and if you love bright, rich colors, this pack is for you. Look at the deep, wonderful, rich tones. We've got a lot of great texture. So this is a great one for creating lots of bold color and intense designs. I think this is such a fun paper pack. So I first up pulled out some papers from the French Industrial collection, and that's what I'm going to use along with this ephemera piece from the Tim Holtz Palette Ephemera Pack. So this palette ephemera pack has a lot of great stuff in it. It's super fun because it has a rainbow of colors throughout for all of these different pieces. I'm going to use that ephemera piece with the pattern paper, and I'm going to start first by cutting a full A2 size panel from this sheet of pattern paper, which features part of the Eiffel Tower. It features some great script and typography elements. And then I also am cutting a border strip about 2 inches just to give myself a little extra, just so that way I could create a border along the bottom of my card, but I wasn't really sure how big I wanted it to be initially. So I attached this pattern paper piece to my card, and then I'm going to layer up the striped panel on top. Once I have that attached with some tape runner, then I used my Tim Holtz scissors to trim that down. This will give me a beautiful contrast down along the bottom of the card. And then I'm going to trim it up with a small little strip with some matte champagne cardstock from Simon's Stamp. The paper trimmer I'm using is Tim Holtz Guillotine Trimmer. I'm using some liquid glue to attach that piece of gold paper along the top of my striped pattern paper piece. It's going to break these two up a little bit and give it a nice trim. I realized after attaching this strip down onto the paper that I wanted to add some splatter. So because I already have the gold strip in place and I don't want the splatter on that, I'm actually just going to put some tape over it to cover it up. And then I'm going to bring in my elements for the splattering. So I have Distress Mica Stain in Frozen Fog, and then I have Distress Spray Stain in Scorched Timber. So for the splattering, I'm just going to use the end of the bottle just to go ahead and splatter that onto my project with both sprays. This will give me a nice mix of color here and a little bit of contrast with that Scorched Timber because it's a little bit darker. And by having the tape in place, that allowed me to keep that strip of metallic cardstock nice and clean, but still get that fun splattering across the background. While that dries, I'm going to work on adding a little bit of distressing to this ephemera panel. I'm using a walnut stain distressing pad, and I'm running it along the edges of the paper, not only to add just some dark contrast along the edges, but I'm also allowing some of that ink to get brushed onto the front of the ephemera as well to give it a slightly more worn feel. And this is going to add a lot of character to the piece. And then I'm going to use some foam squares to pop this up onto my card. I did kind of line this up a little bit closer to the bottom of the card than I did the top. It's not perfectly centered, but I'm going to balance that by adding a little postage element to the top of my ephemera piece. So for that postage element, I'm going to use the postage sticker book from Tim Holtz, and I'm pulling out the blue colors, and I'm going to choose one of these to add onto my ephemera. Originally, I thought I might do purple, but blue is the color I ended up sticking with, and I'm going to attach that along the top here. This will kind of help add a little bit more balance to the placement of this ephemera piece. Next up, I brought in some of these metallic droplets from Tim Holtz. These are beautiful little pearl-like pieces, and I'm using the silver color for this. I want to add these around my ephemera panel just for a bit of shine and elegance. This has a very elegant feel to the card, so I thought by adding those little pearls, that'll add a nice finishing metallic touch to the project, which also goes nicely with the metallic cardstock that we have as the trim in the background. A beautiful card. I love how this turned out. I did not add a greeting to this card, which was intentional, because I can either send the card as is, or I can add a sentiment later when I am ready to mail the card. I can just pull out a simple sentiment strip set from Simon Says Stamp and cut one down and attach it along the bottom of the ephemera panel. So it gives me some options for how I want to be able to use this card later. Next up, I used the Dapper collection, and I'm going to make a masculine card here. I pulled out this set of Tim Holtz dies called Gentleman, and this is such a fun silhouette set. I also am going to use this tag die set from Tim Holtz. It's one of my absolute favorites. I'm going to use the largest tag to cut out my pattern paper here. I'm using this sheet of pattern paper that has the shirts on it. I'm also going to cut the gentleman from two different colors of cardstock. I have an umbrella that I'll cut from the champagne, and then I also have black cardstock that I will cut the silhouette of the gentleman with. So these I'm going to run through my die cut machine. I'm cutting these down just so they're a little bit smaller, and I'll run those through. Then that gives me my two main elements for the middle of my tag. And I'm going to start assembling these onto the project. So I have some foam squares that I'm putting behind the gentleman, and I'm going to center him up right in the middle, and he is going to have the umbrella tucked over his arm. I did add a small little foam square to the back side of the umbrella before I attached it onto the project. That'll hold it in place. But then I'm just going to loop the end of the umbrella, the handle, through his arm, and then attach that down onto the tag. So that's going to hold everything in place. Next up, I'm bringing in this Transparency Things 2 pack, and I'm using this little label. This is a slightly transparent label. That's going to look really cool attached to the side of my tag. But I'm also going to bring in some of these fun rub-ons that create a stitching effect. This is so cool if you don't like to actually sew onto your projects. Something like these rub-ons is such a fun way to add that stitching feel without actually having to pull out a sewing machine. If you like to sew, however, and you have a sewing machine to be able to create that effect, then you could also do that too. I'm attaching the ephemera piece onto my project using some craft tacky glue. Even though it's transparent, the craft tacky glue does dry clear, so you won't see the adhesive. The rub-on works just like any other rub-on. You're going to remove that protective release paper on the back, lay your rub-on onto the project, and then take some sort of tool, whether it's a popsicle stick or a bone folder, and just burnish that rub-on into the project. And I let this overlap with that little ephemera piece, so it now looks like the ephemera panel is attached to my tag with some stitching. Isn't that really cool? I'm going to do the same thing along the bottom. I just want to add a little bit more of that stitching element. I think this really ties nicely with the style of this tag, and using the Dapper collection, which has a lot of great clothing themed elements in it. I think this worked really well. Now I'm going to use the reinforcers from that Tim Holtz tag die set to be able to cut some red metallic cardstock so I can use that reinforcer at the top of my tag. So this I ran through my die cut machine, and then I will use some craft tacky glue to attach it down onto the top of my tag. I've got my tweezers in hand so that way I can easily place this down. I did bring in some twine from Lawn Fawn, and this is the perfect little string to add to the top of my tag. This is going to get glued onto a card base that I'm making from some of the pattern paper. So I did add a little bit of ink blotting to the pattern paper with some antique linen, and then I will also add some stenciling. Now this paper does have a little bit of a coating to it, so when I put the ink down, it does take a little bit of time to dry. And you'll see this best when I go to do the stenciling. So I have this stencil here from Tim Holtz. This is the crossed layering stencil, and I'm going to use pumice stone ink to ink blend just a little bit of this onto my project, just to add a little bit of texture in the corners. So I added 2 areas of blending, and once I had the stenciling done, then I decided to add a little bit more ink blending over top. So I'm going to bring in some walnut stain, and because that ink is still drying, when I add the walnut stain over top, it started to soften off that ink and blend it out. So I am going to come back in and add a little bit more of that stenciling over top of those areas just to bring that back in a little bit. Eventually this ink does dry and it does not rub off, so the stenciling will be in place. But I did just want to point that out, that as you're working on this, just bear in mind that this paper does have a little bit of a coating to it, so your ink may take a little bit of time to dry. So I attached my tag onto the project with some foam tape. I added another ephemera piece down along the left side of the card, and I did also try to distress it a little bit by kind of like folding the side of the ephemera piece up a little bit just to make it look worn. And that's going to give it a little bit more of an authentic feel. I did add a little bit of ink onto that as well, just to give it a little bit more of a burnished look. I'm going to add some buttons as well, because again, we've got that tailored clothing line effect going on here with the theme of this paper. So I felt like the buttons made a great embellishment. So I pulled out a few from my stash. These are things that I have collected. I do think this one that I'm gluing on here, the brownish gold button, I believe that's from a Tim Holtz button pack, but the other 2 were things that I just had in my collection. And then that is going to finish off this card, which is so perfect for giving to somebody in your life who's maybe got a birthday coming up, or it's just a great card to say thinking of you. But again, I didn't add a greeting to this because I can either leave it as is or I can come back and add one later. Now, like I said, I did make a couple of other projects using the new Tim Holtz Idea-ology from the Vault Papers, and I wanted to share those with you too. So one of them is this fun tag. I made this with the Wallflower collection. It was so easy to make because the Wallflower collection is so layered and so beautiful. It really didn't need much decorating. So what I did was I added a palette ephemera bird onto the tag. I made the tag from the pattern paper, and then that ephemera piece, I cut out the bird, glued it on top, and then I simply added one more little ephemera panel up along the top. That's that little number panel. Added some of that stitching rub-on to it, tied on a little bit of twine and ribbon, and that is it. So simple, yet it's such a beautiful tag. This would look gorgeous on a gift, or you could turn it into a card, but the pattern papers are so beautiful and detailed, it really took no time at all to make this. Now this project is really fun. I used memorandum for this one. The memorandum paper is what you see in the background, and I have a Idea-ology frame on top of it. I added this fun paper doll to the side of my project, colored her with a couple of distress crayons, and then I also added a few more ephemera pieces. So the number 814 panel up at the top, and then pay to the order of, and the little 50-cent icon. Those are also from the palette collection. I did add a little feather, which is that piece that you see coming out from behind the pay to the order of panel. That I cut from some shimmer vellum from Simon Says Stamp with the Tim Holtz feather dies. That looks really cute and kind of reminds me of like a feather quill or something. It goes really well with the style of this paper collection. All right, so there you have it. All of the projects that I got to create so far with the Tim Holtz Idea-ology paper release. This From the Vault collection is beautiful, and these papers are available as 8x8s or 12x12s. So you have lots of options for how you want to use them for your different projects. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for stopping by and spending time with me today. I will be back very soon with more to share. But until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks again for stopping by.